Sam stood by the wide oak window of his small apartment, staring at the early morning rain trickling down the glass. The city outside was waking up, bathed in soft gray light, its rhythm steady and familiar. But inside him, everything felt unsteady. Tomorrow was his wedding day. Tomorrow, he would stand beside Dakota, the woman who had restored his faith in love, and promise forever. Yet, his heart wasn't entirely still. On the table behind him lay a single envelope, cream-colored, sealed with a wax stamp he recognized instantly. The initials M.R., Melanie Rose. Sam hadn't seen Melanie in nearly 4 years. They had shared a love once, bright, reckless, all-consuming. The kind that makes you think you've found the center of the universe, until it collapses. Their relationship had burned out in betrayal, regret, and silence. When it ended, it left ashes, ashes he thought he had buried. But last night, while finalizing the guest list, he'd found the letter in his mailbox. No return address, just his name in her handwriting, still looping, elegant, precise. He'd almost thrown it away. Almost. Now, he couldn't stop staring at it. Dakota's voice drifted from the kitchen. "Coffee's ready, babe." Sam blinked, startled back to the present. He tucked the letter into his jacket pocket, as if hiding a secret from the morning light. Dakota appeared, holding 2 mugs, her blonde hair tied in a messy bun, wearing his old college sweatshirt. She smiled, that easy, disarming smile that had first melted him. "You look like you're about to give a TED talk." He chuckled weakly, just thinking. Ideographic period, cold feet. Ideographic period, not even close. He forced a grin. "You make it easy to stay warm." She laughed and kissed him lightly, her lips tasting like cinnamon and hope, but behind that warmth, Sam felt the weight of the letter pressing against his chest like a hidden heartbeat. By afternoon, the rain had stopped. The air smelled clean, like the world had rinsed itself in preparation for the wedding. Sam and Dakota were at her parents' house, going over last-minute details. The backyard was being transformed into a dream. Fairy lights hung from tree branches, white roses lined the aisle, and the small lake behind the property shimmered under the sun. As Dakota and her mother discussed flower arrangements, Sam slipped away to the dock. The lake had always been his place of calm. He reached into his pocket, pulled out Melanie's letter, and hesitated. Then he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, her handwriting as graceful as he remembered. "Sam, I heard you're getting married. I should have expected it, but hearing it still made my breath catch. I don't know what I am to you anymore, a memory, a scar, or just a chapter you've closed. I don't want to disturb your peace, but I needed to write this, to give you something I should have given you long ago. My blessing. You deserve happiness. Even if it isn't with me. Especially if it isn't with me. Love. Melanie." Sam's fingers tightened around the paper. He read it again, then again, as if her words could somehow rewrite the past. He felt something crack inside, not pain, not longing, but a strange relief. "Hey," Dakota's voice called gently from behind. "You okay?" He turned. She was barefoot, walking toward him, sunlight in her hair. "Yeah," he said, folding the letter quickly. "Just needed some air." She smiled and slipped her hand into his. "Tomorrow's the big day. You ready?" He looked at her, at the woman who had stood by him through his rebuilding, through his self-doubt and sleepless nights. She wasn't the fire of his past. She was the calm after the storm. "I'm ready," he said. And for the first time that day, he meant it. The wedding morning came wrapped in sunlight and laughter. The world seemed to hum in anticipation, the scent of roses and champagne mingling in the air. Sam stood in his suit, his best man fussing with his tie, and tried to focus on the moment. But when the ceremony music began and guests began to arrive, his heart stuttered. Among the crowd, near the back row, stood a figure he hadn't expected to see, Melanie. She wore a simple pale blue dress, her auburn hair pulled into a low braid. No jewelry, no pretense, just presence, raw, quiet, real. Their eyes met for a second, a brief, electrified second that stretched time. She nodded softly. Sam felt his throat tighten. "Dude, you okay?" The best man whispered. "Yeah," Sam said, though his pulse betrayed him. "Yeah, I'm okay." When Dakota appeared, the crowd fell silent. She was radiant, all white silk and grace, walking toward him with tears shimmering in her eyes. Every step she took erased another ghost. Every breath she took reminded him, this was home now. They said their vows under the arch of roses. Sam's voice was steady until he reached the final line, "I choose you, every day, forever." His eyes flicked to the back row again. Melanie smiled, a small, tender smile that held no bitterness, only peace. She placed her hand over her heart. And in that moment, Sam understood what the letter had truly meant. It wasn't just forgiveness. It was liberation, for both of them. As the ceremony ended, confetti flew, music swelled, and the guests cheered. Dakota kissed him, and he felt the world melt into light. When he opened his eyes again, Melanie was gone, but her blessing lingered, in the air, in his chest, in the way his heart no longer trembled. The reception was a blur of music, laughter, and sunlight spilling through the white canopy. Glasses clinked, cameras flashed, and the world around Sam pulsed with joy. But in the quiet corners of his mind, he kept thinking about Melanie. Had she really been there? Or had his guilt and nostalgia conjured her out of memory? Dakota was radiant beside him, spinning barefoot on the dance floor, her veil catching the wind. She glowed with happiness, and Sam, for all his joy, felt a small ache inside, not regret, but reflection. He excused himself for a moment, stepping away from the noise. The lake shimmered in the distance. The spot where he had read Melanie's letter earlier that week seemed to call him back. He walked toward it, tie loosened, heart steady, and there she was. Melanie stood by the water, barefoot, her shoes in her hand. The breeze moved through her hair. When she turned to him, there was no tension, only a quiet understanding. "I wasn't sure you'd want me here," she said softly. Sam swallowed. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I almost didn't," she admitted, looking out over the lake. "But I couldn't let you start a new life without closing ours properly." He nodded. "You already did, with the letter." She smiled faintly. "Words can bless, but sometimes, people need to see each other to believe them." They stood in silence. Birds skimmed over the lake. The laughter from the wedding floated faintly across the water, distant and unreal, like it belonged to another lifetime. Melanie glanced at the ring on his finger. "She looks at you the way I never did. Like you're her safe place." "You and I," he began, struggling for words, "we were never about safety. Ideographic period, no," she said with a small laugh. "We were the storm." Sam smiled, genuinely, for the first time when speaking of their past. "We were." She looked back at him, eyes glistening. "I'm glad the storm ended well for you, Sam." "And for you?" he asked. She hesitated, then said quietly, "The storm's what taught me how to sail." Their eyes met, and for a moment, they were just two people standing at the edge of what once was, not enemies, not lovers, but survivors. When the wind shifted, carrying the sound of Dakota's laughter, Melanie exhaled and smiled. "Go to her," she said gently. "She's your forever." He hesitated. "Will I ever see you again?" Melanie shook her head. "You already have, the version of me that could finally let you go." Then she turned, walking away down the path that led into the trees, Sam stood there for a long time, watching until she disappeared from view. Only then did he realize, for the first time in years, that his heart was quiet. That night, long after the guests had gone and the fairy lights dimmed, Sam and Dakota lay under the stars beside the lake. The music had faded, replaced by the soft sounds of crickets and wind. Dakota rested her head on his chest, tracing circles on his hand. "You were quiet today," she murmured. "Even for you." He hesitated. "Someone from my past showed up." She looked up, eyes calm. "Melanie?" He froze. "You knew?" Dakota smiled faintly. "She sent me a letter last month. Ideographic period, what?" Dakota sat up, her eyes shimmering with something tender and wise. "She said she wanted to make sure I knew she was at peace, that she wanted us both to be happy. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to stir old wounds." Sam stared at her, awed. "You read it? Ideographic period." "I did. And I cried, not out of jealousy, but because it was beautiful. I realized then, she wasn't your mistake, Sam. She was your lesson." He reached for her hand. "You're more forgiving than I deserve." Dakota smiled. "No, I'm just a woman who loves a man who finally learned what love means." They sat there together, stars rippling across the lake. Sam whispered, "I think she came today to say goodbye." "And you?" He looked at Dakota and smiled softly. "I came here to say hello, to forever." Years passed. The wedding photos yellowed slightly at the edges. The house by the lake became filled with memories, framed laughter, gentle arguments, and the quiet sound of two souls who had built a life from second chances. Sam became a teacher, literature, mostly. He loved telling his students that stories weren't about perfection, but about redemption. Dakota started her own art studio in town, painting the sky as if it were a living thing. They had a daughter, Lena, who inherited her mother's laughter and her father's steady eyes. Life moved gently, like water smoothing stone. Then, one autumn afternoon, as golden leaves swirled across the yard, a small package arrived in the mail. No return address. Sam opened it carefully. Inside was a simple silver charm, a tiny compass, and a note in familiar handwriting. "For when your heart forgets how far it's come. Ideographic period. M." Sam smiled, tears rising without sadness. He showed it to Dakota. She traced the compass with her finger. "She remembered you. Ideographic period, she remembered us," he said softly. "All of us." They hung the charm in the window, where sunlight caught it every morning. It spun gently in the breeze, reflecting light onto the walls, tiny moving stars that danced across their home. Sometimes, when Sam sat by the lake with Lena on his lap, he'd tell her stories, not fairy tales, but truths wrapped in wonder. Once, he'd say, there was a man who thought love was a storm. But then he met someone who taught him it could also be a sunrise. And as the lake rippled gold under the setting sun, Sam would glance toward the trees, half expecting to see a flash of blue, the color of Melanie's dress that day, and feel, once again, her invisible blessing moving through the wind. On the 10th anniversary, Dakota surprised Sam with a trip, back to the same place they'd been married. The house looked older, the dock creaked, but the lake still held the same calm. They walked hand in hand, barefoot, laughing at how the years had softened them but deepened their love. When they reached the dock, Sam noticed something tucked between the wooden planks, weathered, but intact. It was Melanie's original letter. The ink had faded, but her words remained. Ideographic period, you deserve happiness. Even if it isn't with me. He showed it to Dakota, who smiled. I think she'd be happy to know how right she was. Sam nodded. She gave me peace before I even knew I needed it. Dakota leaned into him. And you gave it back, by living. They stood there as the sun sank behind the trees, the water shimmering with light. For a moment, Sam thought he heard a whisper in the breeze, gentle, familiar, and free. "Be happy, Sam," he smiled, eyes glistening. "I am, Mel. I really am." And somewhere between memory and eternity, a soul finally rested, knowing her blessing had become the very life she'd hoped for him to live.